So I would like to begin with a quotation that will be familiar to some of you. And this is Voltaire in his philosophical letters, writing from London and saying, "Enter into the London Royal Exchange, where the representation of all nations gather for the utility of mankind. There, the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian behave toward each other as if they were of the same religion, and reserve the word infidel for those who go bankrupt." This vignette is the most iconic statement I know of about the supposed market's indifference to religious identity and identitarian concerns in general, written before the 19th century. And the rhetorical power of Voltaire's words is undeniable. And the gist of his vision, I think, speaks today to some of us, or at least resonates. However, this was and is fiction. A number of critics, beginning with Henry Hauerbach and many others, have demonstrated that this crisp passage meant to be didactic, pedagogical, instructive, rather than a realistic representation of the Royal Exchange in London at the time in the early to mid 18th century. And indeed, there are a number of commercial manuals and literature from the time that contradict Voltaire's Voltaire's idealized image. Take this one from a recent then Dictionary of Trade and Commerce. Here you see that this author actually draws a chart, a floor plan, I should say, of the walkways in the Royal Exchange in London. And it shows that, first of all, that the space, according to him, was allocated according to some group categories. And to complicate matters further, there's more than one criteria of classification. So some groups are identified by more or less a specific geographical by their geographical provenance. Others by their professional affiliation. And two labels, Armenian in the singular and Jews in the plural, are kind of mixed taxonomical categories because these are ethno-religious groups who didn't have one single provenance and were not engaged in one single trading professional activities. So accuracy and consistency aside, what this floor plan and the description that comes with it in this Dictionary of Commerce captures are two salient patterns that we find across all the cities of early modern Europe and their sprawling colonial territories. First feature I want to emphasize is that everywhere there existed some degree of segregation. There's a whole spectrum, and we'll talk about the spectrum. There's a whole range of possibilities for how to allocate the physical space to those who are considered as belonging to different groups. And second pattern is that there were in the same place a variety and sometimes seemingly contradictory criteria to organize that space and therefore the groups that inhabited it. So how to categorize group was actually a problem and a challenge even for this period in history when we're usually told that everybody was organized in group. But actually how to organize in group wasn't that easy or that consistent. So to illustrate these two trends that I just mentioned and some of their repercussions on the everyday organization of business relations, today I will focus on one city, the port city of Livorno, on the coastal side of Tuscany, which and I'll talk about. It's one of the Italian cities that also has an English name because there were a lot of Brits there. So it also is known as Leghorn, but I will call it with its Italian name. So why Livorno, of all the cities I could have picked today? In part because it has a reputation for being a cosmopolitan city, and a reputation it has both in Italian academic writing, but also in French and English and foreign language. This word is thrown around a lot, and it has this reputation even beyond the academy. So, for example, the golf club nearby Livorno is called the Cosmopolitan Golf Club, which tells you something about this reputation. So, why does it have this reputation? This place that it's sort of not probably in your geographical mental map as other more famous cities. Livorno was initially a small fisherman village, which in the year 1421, the then still Republic of Florence, 1421 is just before Cosimo returns and then becomes sort of the informal ruler still of the Republic of Florence. The Republic of Florence purchased Livorno from the Republic of Genoa, which was the ruler until then, and initially doesn't do much with it. Then say after 1530, the Republic of Florence becomes the dynastic Grand Duchy of Tuscany, ruled dynastically by the Medici family, that decides to engage in international commercial competition and finds that the previous important port of Pisa had by then become, gone inland because of the debris of the Arno River, and so decides to turn Livorno from this small peripheral fisherman village into a new city, hires one of their favorite architects, Bernardo Buontalenti, and instructs Buontalenti to design the perfect Renaissance city. So this kind of forgotten place is turned into this, and you can see here from this map, this five-star shape and this very, rectangular, perfectly organized floor plan of the city, constructed according to the ideals of the Renaissance city. In addition, the Medici build a canal linking Livorno to the Arno River to facilitate the transport of goods from the coast to the city. And in 1607, through ceremonies, it bestows the title of city to this new magnificent urban outpost. So having built the civil, the military, and the port infrastructure, now the Medici have to populate this place with the right kind of people to turn it into potentially competitive port city in the increasingly crowded international arena. So they attract mariners, they attract dock workers, but they also have to attract not just traders in general, but kind of like the right kind of traders from across the Mediterranean. And today we have, as you will see later in some other slides, Livorno, there's almost no trace of this extraordinary Renaissance city, largely because it was bombed by the Allies in 43 and 44, because it was a major railroad and port location very near the Gothic line where the Allies were fighting the Nazis. So northern Italy was occupied by the Nazis. So Today, we only have the pale vestiges of this cosmopolitan, so to speak, presence of a myriad of communities, including a rather unusual, if not extraordinary, religious liberties for this being a very Catholic state. So we have only the facade of what used to be the Armenian church. We have the Greek Catholic Church. The Orthodox Church existed, but is no longer standing. This was a very interesting church. You see the facade is very, very plain, in part because it didn't want to stand out. It was a church in which a number of Eastern Mediterranean Christian denominations were allowed to have their altars. The Medici also had to make accommodation, because there were all these communities, also for their afterlives. The Catholic Church doesn't allow Protestants to be buried in consecrated Catholic territories, but in Livorno they made an exception. So there were a number of non-Catholic cemeteries. This is the English, so-called English cemeteries. There was a huge exception to what was the norm in our Catholic countries in the pre-modern period, in the early, sort of post-Reformation, early modern period. In 1707, the Grand Duchy allowed for the presence of an Anglican pastor in Livorno, which did not exist anywhere else in France or in the Italian peninsula. The legal foundations of what today is referred to as Livorno's cosmopolitanism were rooted in one document, one rather extraordinary document, a charter, colloquially at the time known as Livornina. This is the 1593 version. There had been a previous 1591 version, but it was superseded by the second one, which was addressed to a number of communities. And here you can see an echo of the rather heterogeneous taxonomy used for the floor plan of the Royal Exchange in London. It is addressed to Levantine, Ponentines, Spanish, Portuguese, Greeks, Germans, Italian, Jews, Turks, Moors, Armenians, Persians, and others. And we could talk at length about these criteria, but it just tells you that it's not only in London, everywhere exactly what these labels meant. It's not always very consistent. Now, although the charter was addressed to this variety of trading communities and to others, the actual clauses, when you go and read the text, this actually 1593 text was negotiated in part through the input of a Jewish representative. And when you read the actual clauses, it becomes very clear who the primary recipients of this charters were meant to be. And these were the descendants of those Jews who had been forced to be baptized in Iberia, the so-called Sephardic Jews from the medieval Hebrew term Sepharad, which indicated the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain, probably many of you are familiar with, Jews were expelled in 1494. A great number of them went to nearby Portugal, where only, upon payment of a significant amount, in fact, and then just 3 years later were forced to convert. Because there was no Inquisition at the time, it was a little easier to even to live as converted Jews. There wasn't as much inquiry into their behavior and their belief. But after the creation of the Portuguese Inquisition in 1536, life for so-called baptized Jews, or also new Christians, as they were called at the time, became more difficult. And it is not a coincidence that beginning in the 1550s, a number of European states and city-states targeted their effort to those very Jews who were resident in Portugal now were no longer feeling safe and were perhaps potentially interested in leaving, but they could go to the Ottoman Empire where there was no Inquisition at all. So in order to persuade them to come to Catholic or Protestant Europe, but particularly to Catholic Europe where there were inquisitions, you had to make special provisions for them. In Livorno, I wanted to just do a comparison because the 1593 charter issued by the Medici was inspired largely from a charter from a few years prior issued by the Venice Republic, also to address to the so-called Ponentine, to the Sephardic Jews. But in Venice, there was a ghetto. The first time the word ghetto is used is for the Jewish quarter in Venice, which had two entrances, which were closed from down to dusk. They were guarded by Christian guards, who were paid by the Jewish community. So it was an enclosed space. And other ethno-religious minorities lived in other parts of the city with different degrees of greater or lesser segregation. And in Livorno, instead, there was no ghetto. There was no ghetto. The poor, the more poor, families of the Jewish communities lived in a neighborhood in the surroundings of the synagogue. These are representation. This is an engraving. In Livorno, there was only one official community synagogue. They succeeded in doing that, unlike in most places where there are several Jews, there are usually multiple synagogues. The synagogue was rebuilt in the 19th century and then nearly destroyed, as I mentioned earlier, by the Allies bombing. And I spared you the picture of the 1962 building, which would win the contest of one of the ugliest buildings. Unfortunately, today, if you go to Livorno, the buildings that withstood the bombing of the Allies are mostly fascist buildings, which, if, like me, you like modernist architecture in Italy, unfortunately, all modernist architecture is fascist. But there's very little. This picture is one of the very few remnants of the 16th century fortifications. There's very little vestiges of that beautiful city that it once was. The most affluent Jews. I don't have a picture from a visualization from Livorno, but this is one of the families from Venice that then moved to Livorno. This is a prominent banker in Amsterdam. This is probably one of the most Jewish, one of the wealthiest bankers in Amsterdam, regardless of whether he was Jewish or not. But just to give you a sense that these are a particular subset of the Jewish diaspora. It's very highly acculturated. These men are not wearing a beard, which stands out, and they're almost indistinguishable from their attire from the local elites. And these highly acculturated Jews in Livorno are allowed to live anywhere in the city. So the poor one congregate around the synagogue, but you see this very straight. This is the equivalent of Main Street. And when the Grand Duchy, when the Grand Dukes would arrive in town for a procession, the procession and the ceremonies would be here. And some well-to-do Jewish family lived along that city, which is just not something that you find in any other early modern city of this period. Now, appearances should not lead us to think that religious and social animosity had dissipated. Consider that in Livorno, as everywhere in pre-modern Europe, there only existed religious marriages. You couldn't have a separate civil and religious marriage. And for the Catholic Church, you had to be converted to Catholicism in order to marry a Catholic. So this alone created a high degree of segregation. So Jews intermarried among Jews, Catholic intermarried among Catholics. There were, some crypto situation, but not in Livorno because of these incentives that were created to separate. In fact, these are all in part incentives to make sure the Jews and Christians are quite well segregated. A number of articles in the 1593 charter, in fact, tell us indirectly that the Jews were exposed to what today we will call hate crimes. There are articles that say that anyone who was found guilty of calumny against a Jew was obliged to pay the ensuing legal expenses. There's an article saying that any insults or violence, these are quotations, committed against Jews celebrating their religious rites and holidays were punished. So that tells you that if these articles are in place, it's because Jews were exposed even to the threat of physical violence. So that's where I'm beginning to question the intuitive idea of cosmopolitanism. These people lived together and had extraordinary forms of accommodation, but it doesn't mean that the degree of contestation and animosity that existed elsewhere had gone away. Another set of articles in the 1593 charter tells us that the charter had been tailor-made for Sephardic Jews and for Sephardic merchants in particular. The Medici explicitly write in the charter that any Jew hailing from Iberia would be sheltered from inquiries that the Inquisition might wish to make on their prior religious allegiances. So once they arrived in Livorno, if they lived as Jews, the Inquisition had no jurisdiction over them. And some of you in the division of late medieval and Reformation studies should be jumping on their chair because you know that Inquisition did not have any jurisdiction on Jews and on Muslims, but the Inquisition has jurisdiction on anyone who has been baptized of any, in their view, on any Christian denomination. And by definition, if you were born in Portugal after 1497, you had been baptized. And if you had been baptized and then you arrive in Livorno, some men were sent to North Africa to be circumcised and then came back. If you arrived in Livorno and lived as a Jew, you were an apostate. And then every apostate was, in theory, according to canon law, subjected to the Inquisition jurisdiction. So here you have a secular ruler who says to the Inquisition, you can arrive up to Pisa and then you stop. And you can go to Florence and Siena, do whatever you want, but not here. In addition, there are articles in the charter that tells us how important it was for the Medici to protect the freedom of movement and the safety of the person and properties of those who were coming to do their business there. Jewish merchants in Livorno were authorized to trade, quote, under a Christian or other name. And we'll see why this camouflage was very useful. Sounds weird, but there was a reason, we will see. They were allowed to carry out any occupation of their choosing and also to own real estate, including in the countryside, which is also very unusual. They could own so-called slaves, that is Muslim captives of the piracy and religious wars in the Mediterranean, and even hire Christian and domestic servants and wet nurses in their homes, which was a sign of being well-to-do. They, in Livorno, and this is the last piece of the normative legal framework I want to give you, the Medici also created a very unusual, actually a unique form of Jewish tribunal, which was staffed not by rabbis, as everywhere else, but by lay elected Jewish leaders of the community. So these were merchants, essentially. that staffed this tribunal, and all litigation among Jews had to go in the first instance before the Jewish tribunal. And only upon appeal over a certain monetary ceiling, or it would be heard by the secular tribunal, which also heard all lawsuits between Jews and Christians, obviously. So this is a high degree of delegation of power to the leaders of the Jewish community, which on the one hand releases the Medici for having to take care of that administrative burden. Early modern states don't have a lot of capacities. The little money they have, they use for war, not great social services and any form of bureaucracy. It's often difficult to staff. But it had also, and that's another point I want to stress, by forcing Jews to adjudicate their internal disputes, not in religious, but in all civil and to some degree minor criminal matters, it also created another form of segregation. So by strengthening the self-governing of the Jewish community, it also created separation. So to summarize what I've said this far, this 1593 charter enabled Sephardic merchants to flourish in Livorno and render them like any other merchants in some respects, but also assume that they were not like any other merchant. It made their privileges contingent upon their affiliation to a corporate body, it was called the Jewish nation, whose degree of self-rule was at once a measure of its autonomy and its subordinate position within the body politic. So there was a coexistence of contractual equality between Jewish merchants and Christian merchants, and a sense of separate corporate status. And it is this coexistence that I think makes this, as well as other cities, and I'll try to offer some comparison later, very compelling. And it's also a reason why in my work I have preferred to speak of communitarian cosmopolitanism as opposed to cosmopolitanism in general. So how did this environment, these legal norms and the social environment shape the behavior of individual merchants who were there to trade at the time, individual Jewish merchants? I was lucky enough a long time ago to stumble upon a really large collection of letters by one of these Sephardic mercantile firms. These are more than 13,000 letters written by a firm and when the firm went bankrupt, the tribunal seized all the private account books and letter because merchants kept a copy of everything they sent out. Merchants fundamentally spend their day writing. It's very clear. There's somebody said, you know, merchants always had their ink, their fingers stained with ink. It is very rare to find letters that a merchant received. I found them untouched only once in my life, and I spent a lot of time looking for merchant letters. This was in a private confraternity to which a merchant family had bequeathed their family assets, and they had never been opened. So that gives you a sense. This is not the collection I worked on, but it gives you a sense of the materiality. So when a merchant firm received the letters were not in envelopes. They were folded, and the address was on the outside with the seal. And then, oops, what did I do? They were piled in these Utah sacks, and the archivist wasn't very attentive, so I opened these and took some pictures. But I put them back. But it was a really great, very, very emotional, because I know strange things for historians, but I'd never seen it. But in Livorno, I've never seen anything of the sort. And it is very very common is too much, but if you're lucky enough to find a collection of letters, they are in the bounded books that firms kept, as it happened in this time, because these letters were Each letter is a contract. If you tell somebody, please sell this on my behalf, and then the person doesn't do it, a merchant is allowed to bring the copy of that letter before a judge as, and it has probatory value. So this firm was called Ergas and Silveira, the name of the last names of the two families from which was formed. Unfortunately, Ergas is very unusual as a Jewish name, so it helped me as a, if it had been, Cohen and Silveira, I would have abandoned it. It would have been strange because Cohen is an Ashkenazi, but if it had been Pinheiro and Silveira, it would have been much difficult. And it had two branches, one in Aleppo. I mean, the main branch, this is gone anyway, but you can see. One is in Livorno, the main branch, and one in Aleppo, which was the arrival point of very important caravan trade from Central Asia. It was a little bit on the promontory in the mountain, and it was linked to a port city that was infested with plague. Nobody wanted to be there, so they lived up. This firm, Ergas and Silveira, was formed through very carefully arranged marriage alliances. So in 1705, Moses Ergas, who was probably the person who engineered this, had David Silveira marry his sister Esther. Okay, so Moses' sister Esther marries this business partner, and the brother of the business partner is sent to Aleppo, which tells you that he's the lower in the business partner, because by this period, there's very little plague in Europe. The last major plague, actually the last plague in Europe is 1720 Marseille, and there's still a lot of plague in North Africa and in the Middle East. So if you're the more, sort of the one who has the upper hand in the firm, you don't want to go to Aleppo. So the brother of the junior partner is sent to Aleppo. Two things I wanted to know about this family arrangement. One is that these are all Sephardic Jewish families, so they are intermarrying within a subset of the diaspora. And the second important thing I want you to take with you is that this is what we usually call a general partnership. This is a partnership in which all the partners, initially Moses and David, have full liability toward each other and toward all the creditors. The fundraising happens through the marriage. The dowry of these women, Bianca del Rio and Esther Ergas, are entered in the account books of the partnership. So the dowries of the women is what finances the business. The general partnership in which everybody is liable toward each other and toward external creditor is considered a very traditional form of doing business that doesn't allow for great advancement. And that's one of the points I will like to question in what follows. So where did these letters go? These letters go to a lot of locations. They don't go everywhere. Each firm has to specialize and carve out a certain space. The number of letters sent to a certain destination is not a proxy for the importance of that destination in a trading network, because in this period, information only travel as fast as human beings. You can send a printed book, you can send a manuscript letter. It's going to go on a ship, on a donkey, and it only arrives there when the people who are carrying the transport arrive there. There were experiments, for example, if you think lighthouses are forms of ways of transmitting information faster than human beings. There were some traveling pigeons. Apparently, in one of the travel accounts in Aleppo, I read that there were traveling pigeons between this infested, plague-infested port. But they're very tiny. So fundamentally, before the invention of the telegraph that was initially used for military purpose and then took a while to be affordable for business purposes, so there was, in this period, there was a very frequent courier between Florence and Venice since the 15th century. There was very frequent, not quite daily, but almost. So, but if you wanted to send a letter to Goa, and we'll get there was only one convoy of ship that left once a year. So, you can write 500 letters, more than one a day, but they're all going to go on the same ship. So there's no point, right? So this hierarchy of number of letters should not be taken as a hierarchy of the importance of this destination. It's important for us to immerse ourselves in a world in which the risks linked to distance are enormous compared to what, in fact, this is a world in which distance is always measured in time. If you read travel accounts, they say it took so many days to go somewhere. They don't say the place is X amount of miles from somewhere. So there were a number of, when I was reading this letter the first time, it struck me there are a number of cities that would include Marseille and certainly Lisbon, where Jews are not allowed to live. So I'm like, who are the, in Venice, okay, they have both Florence, Venice, Amsterdam, they can trade with both Jews and Christians, but Marseille, Lisbon, they can't, right? And then when I got to Goa, I was even more puzzled because, as I just said, it takes an enormous amount of time. There is a branch of the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa, a rather gruesome one according to Protestant British travel accounts. So why would anybody engage in a trade with Lisbon and Goa under such risky condition? There is no, you have to depend, if you're whether you're Christian or Jewish in Tuscany, you have to depend on a foreign fleet, on foreign military protection. There's no international trade or arbitration. So why? Well, the first answer is that there were very high prospect for profit because the Mediterranean at the time was still very rich in red coral. The ecosystem today is very depleted. There were some areas, this is a modern picture from today's Tabarka, which is a small town in Tunisia that lived off the coral economy. And Livorno became, the coral was harvested by poor mariners with this technique. They would send out this wooden cross, try to get as many branches as possible, but then sometimes they had to plunge and do the work. It was very difficult, very debilitating summer work. And Livorno became set up between September and November a coral fair for the Mediterranean. So everybody would go to Livorno and sell their raw coral there. We don't have pictures from the time, but we know that a lot of women were employed in turning these branches into beads, not just you probably have seen very ornamental work of art, but they were also made into a lot of beads of different shapes and sizes. Why? Because coral had very, very high resale value in the Indian subcontinent, particularly in northern India. And as it happened, the Indian subcontinent until the 1720s was also the only major known repository of diamonds and diamond mines in the world. The first mines in Brazil were discovered in 1728. And then in South Africa, it's only in the 1860s. So India became this place where traders, not just Jewish, but Jewish traders specialized in this international barter, if you wish, brought coral beads and trade them for rough diamonds. And, as you can imagine, that is what made them, engage in this enterprise. Golconda was the major site of the major diamond mines. Now, how was this trade constructed? In fact, it was a trade organized through what I would call a network of merchant communities. First of all, these were not individuals. It worked because in each place there were communities that policed each other. There was not one institutional overarching authority. And the second feature to which I want to call your attention, which will become important for our story, is that the trading representative overseas were not business partners, they were commission agents. So the Ergas and Silvera among themselves had a general partnerships in which everyone was liable, and then they hire people to whom they paid a commission, 1%, 5%, and the commission agent had full independent legal liability. The network of communities involved was one in a number of Catholic merchants in Lisbon, where this church was one of the few that survived the famous, since we evoked Voltaire, 1756 earthquake that destroyed almost all downtown Lisbon. Obviously, there was no such thing as Italy or the Italians at the time, but that's how they called themselves. These were primarily Florentines and Genoese, some Venetians, some Neapolitans. And for the purpose of their representation vis-a-vis the government, they had in ceremonies and so forth, they had a confraternity which was called the Italian Church of Our Lady of Loreto. And in this church, there's some parish archives where I found testaments and last wills of this. But it's a network of merchants. Here in Goa, there were a number of families, of Hindu families, not converted. The Portuguese were, even if they had the Inquisition in Goa, they became rather weak numerically and politically vis-a-vis the local communities, and they had to rely on these Hindu families as translators, as collector of their taxes, and intermediators. And the business letters from the families that Ergas and Silvera traded with are no longer extant, but in the Jesuit archives in Goa, which remained Portuguese until 1962, I found letters, addressed to Livorno and from Livorno to India, from groups of families that indicate that this networks continued even after the firm I was studying went bankrupt. So the point here is that these are networks of communities that are policing their own internal merchants, their own internal members, so that they could trade with one another. And we know that this was not just a flimsy thing, but a more substantive network for a number of reasons, a number of documents from other sources than the one Ergas and Silvera, including a set of official documents from the Chancery of the King of Portugal, which went in 1739, it has to launch a war to resist the advance of the Maratha, this local empire, which is threatening to conquer Goa. They create some fundraising, some bonds that are, the Chancery document speaks of the money that is borrowed from the merchants of the kingdom and from those in Livorno and Amsterdam. And this is just a euphemism. This is the King of Portugal. They cannot say, we're borrowing money from Jews, but that's what this line is saying. And then in the various pages of these documents, the names of the families the king is borrowing from are the same families with whom Ergas and Silvera is trading. So this is a very established network. I hope I've provided you enough evidence to believe me that this is not just something that happens one day and not the other day. Now, slight turn of event. 1737, a certain Aga Menasseh Mizrahi, a Jewish trader from Hamdan in Western Iran, shows up in Aleppo with a 60-carat diamond, which is an enormous stone. Just to give you a sense, the Koh-i-Noor, which is a diamond that originally belonged to the Mughal emperor, that was looted by Nadir Shah and later looted by the British Crown and was cut several times. It now weighs 105 carats. So 60 carat is more than half of the Koh-i-Noor, nothing that the Ergas and Silvera had ever seen before. In Aleppo, the junior partner, Elijah Silvera, who was the local head of Ergas and Silvera, until then he had only traded in small little diamonds, which came in purses and in small assortments. There was a completely different beast even today. And he must have dreamed of huge profits when he saw this, this huge diamond, and this fellow showed up. And Elijah didn't realize how difficult it was and still is to cut and to predict what happens after you cut a large diamond, and how difficult, even for experienced cutters, is to predict the value of an uncut stone of that size. And naively, but as a member of a general partnership, he has the authority to sign an agreement that binds all his partners in Livorno. So he signs an agreement with the Iranian Jew, lending him a considerable sum in exchange for the right to transport the diamond to Europe and to put it up for sale. The assumption is we're going to sell it for so much more money, and then we'll split the profit, and also he'll have to give us back the loan. Note that the Jewish community in Hamadan, had absolutely no relation with the Sephardic diaspora, the subset of the Jewish diaspora to which Ergas and Silvera belonged. The point is, Ergas and Silvera had a lot of relations with the Catholics in Lisbon and the Hindu in Goas, and no relation, personal, social, otherwise, never seen this guy, comes out of nowhere. This is important. So the plan was to do a tour of the 7 provinces. There's a whole diary that's kept at the Bodleian Library in Oxford of this travel. And it's a pretty elaborate scheme. They go to the court in Versailles, etc. So for 3 years, from 1741 to 43, to represent Ergas and Silvera, they're too posh to travel, right? It's uncomfortable. So they have 2 representatives to do the tours of the major capitals of Europe, together with this Jewish Iranian fellow, and they seek in vain to sell the diamond. The man, interestingly, the man that they hired to surveil and to travel with Menasseh was a Sephardic Jew from Venice, with whom they had, very strong intermarriage and a close personal and business tie. And soon, this fellow, Jacob Belilius, start writing letters back to Livorno to, keep his bosses updated on how things are going. Tells them things are not going well at all. It turns out the quality of the diamond doesn't seem, it's being inspected by all these experts, and doesn't look like it's as good as they have imagined. And that given the terms of the agreement that the young Elijah has signed with Menasseh, they had to keep on going. But the Iranian Jew at some point, he had no interest in selling the diamond because he owed money to Ergas and Silvera. So he didn't want this to succeed. In fact, he began to boycott their efforts to sell the stone. Now, in the thousands of letters that Ergas and Silvera wrote to both Jewish and non-Jewish agents of and partners of their networks, they stuck to formality to the point that they are so dull and so boring, you have to trust me, nothing transpires. Their sentiments about these, all I want to know is like, what do they feel? What do they think about these Hindu? Like nothing. It's all business. It's all legal. Nothing. The one person with whom they lost their temper was this Iranian associate. They lash out. They call him, these are quotation, a hardhead, a barbarian, a bad man, an infamous type, even a dog. A dog is a very typical, terrible Christian insult for Jews. So it's peculiar, but it's really, they lost it. And the vehemence of their anger is a measure of their powerlessness. They had no kinship relation with him. They had no congregational ties. They lacked any leverage to sanction Manasseh socially. And they went to court, and in Amsterdam, in Livorno, the court says, you sign this contract out of your own, completely voluntarily, where, it's not up to us, it's up to you. So long story short, back in Livorno, things drag out in court. There's no legal resolution. The diamond is sold eventually at an auction at a loss. In the end, Ergas and Silvera had only their own naivete to blame for their bankruptcy, not their choice of enterprise, the fact that they were a general partnership, a traditional forms of doing business. That was not the source of their, unless for the fact that their junior partner signed a contract on everyone's behalf. They certainly didn't have their Hindu or Christian agents overseas to blame. They traded with them for decades successfully. And the operations of other Sephardic firms in Livorno, to the extent that they're documented, not in such detail, but there are scattered records, suggest that for the most part, they also adopted the same business model, one that revolved around a general partnership at its core, knitted out of marriage alliances among well-chosen families, and that it extended through various satellites to these commission agents whom they recruited from both within and beyond the diaspora. So for our purposes, the significance of this business models lies in the fact that it cannot be pigeonholed under the collectivist versus individualist mentality. It's not either cosmopolitan or traditional. And I don't have time to go into detail, but there are possibilities that I'm trying to explore to compare this business model with how Sephardic Jews operated in Amsterdam, which was the most open of all early modern European cities. But let me conclude. I'm tempted sometimes to summarize a prevailing view, both within and beyond academia, by paraphrasing a well-known dictum. Tell me how you organize your business and I'll tell you who you are. An authoritative proponent of this view, I don't have time for Amsterdam, is Nobel Prize winner Douglas C. North, a pioneer of the new institutional economic history, who in many influential, important works have argued for an evolutionary story in which particularly Western business evolved from, it's a history of limited liability, of how Western European businesses broke out of the predominance of general partnership with the beginning of this commenda that evolved through times, through the ends of the Italians, through the English regulated company, and finally the joint stock companies. So the idea here, there is a progressive story that leads to the modern corporation. And this progressive story is also a story in which changes in business organization maps onto changes in mentality, even in civilizational forms to some extent, and the market becomes ever more impersonal, ever more similar to how the vignette by Voltaire, with which we began, would be, except that that, as I said, was fiction. So this is not the line of argument I offered you. I do believe in the two-way process between theory and observation, but it does help to approach, I think it does help to approach documents and primary sources with some hypothesis. There's so many of them that otherwise we get overwhelmed. But we also have to be open to revise our initial hypothesis when compelling evidence tells us to do so. So one of the things I've tried to do in this very brief presentation is to give some of those of you who are not practicing historians a concrete sense of what some of us or many of us mean when we say that history matters. It's not just a slogan. It is a veritable heuristic tools. There are some generalizations, such as this, that can actually be revised through the intensive study of particular case studies, particularly when we are able to go from case studies to generalizations, and which is something I want to end here with. So here we've immersed ourselves in a world to understand how past economic actors made strategic decisions knowing that they faced a certain incentive, certain opportunities, and certain constraints. And the fact that the Erga Saint Silvera was organized as a very traditional form of business did not prevent them from having opportunistic business relations with groups with whom they would have never had, like Erga Saint Silvera would have never allowed their daughters to marry one of the Hindu traders in Goa, let alone one of the Catholic neighbors. In Tuscany, limited liability, the one that North heralds as a more advanced form of business, was available. And in fact, only a minuscule number of firms took advantage of it. So in this respect, Erga Saint Silvera was not an exception. The exception is the amount of paper trail that they left and that allow us to reconstruct way of doing business that otherwise remain below our knowledge. So there is evidence, for example, from late 18th century England, therefore a place and time where there existed the modern corporation, that merchants followed a very similar business model. So this is a merchant in Leeds who replied the following to his son, who had asked him for advice about whether he should form a partnership with a certain Monsieur Mirac or not. And the father says, it is very weighty affair to form a partnership and requires deliberation and inquiries. As to Mr. Mirac, he may or may not be a person of property and honor, and therefore it behoves you to enter into no connection with him, but what are mere commissions. This is exactly what Erga Saint Silvera did. They did partnerships with their close kin and commissions, that is, paid commission fees to people who acted on their behalf, but were not liable together with them. So I'm going to end here, and at a minimum, I would like you to take away from this story that I told you that trust is not a matter of everything or nothing. It is built on degrees of delegation and confidence that needs not be all-encompassing. Familiarity among strangers can be modulated and can generate mutually beneficial cooperation. Thank you.